Okay. Hello Vermont history students, and welcome to the video for Unit 5 of the semester. We are in week 3, and this is the video for Monday and Tuesday of the third week. And I will make this video and then I will go load it onto YouTube, and when I do, I will summarize the results of town meeting. I've already been on the discussion board, the forum this morning, and had a look at your responses to those people who had already written in about town meeting. They were great, and so I'm looking forward to seeing just how unified Vermont was in the era of market revolution based on your input on those 3 primary documents. As far as assessment papers go, the papers that are going to be coming in, you are going to be assessing unity. I've already received a couple papers, and I'm looking forward to hopefully grading those this afternoon. I expect more to roll in the next couple days, and it is a rolling in sort of thing. I can be as rigid about deadlines as you individually want me to be, but that isn't necessary. I mean, I tend to want to sort of in an online class work with your complicated schedules, but I do want to be really clear about the assignment in a couple ways. Number one, I was the discussion question number 4 sort of made me a little nervous because some of you seem to think I was asking you who you thought a Vermonter back then was, and I have absolutely no interest at all throughout the whole course in who you think a Vermonter is. I just don't. It's not what I'm asking you. In that question I was asking you, back then, how did people see the term Vermonter? What did they think? And that's what the assessment papers are about. If back then, in the area you're studying, if people all thought that no one was a Vermonter, well, that's unity. As far as wise use of land goes, if everyone thought that to totally tear up and destroy the environment was wise use of land, whether you think that's dumb or not is not the point. The point was there was unity. And so you're measuring how much did Vermonters, uphillers and downhillers, agree about these things. If, as far as making society fair, if everyone thought that, you know, wearing Viking helmets made society fair, and you're like, it doesn't make sense. It's not about you, it's about what did people think then. Try to understand history on its own terms. Okay? What did people think back then? And of course on these assessment papers you want to pick a 50 or 60 year period to cover, and you'll space out your papers, and so hopefully you'll be able to tell the story of Vermont's past like a story. And history is a story that you tell yourself about yourself. And so this first paper, I assume, you know, you'll go from maybe 1780 to 1840 or something like that. I mean, it's really dictated by your sources, by the information that you're using when you have a starting point, when you have an ending point. But do establish a baseline. How united was the imagined community of Vermonters at the beginning, and then stuff happens, and then at the end, how relatively united was it at that point. And I'm not grading you on your answer. You know, you can have answers that are all over the place comparatively across the class. I'm grading you on how well you make the argument, how clearly you make the argument, and how well you use sources. And on that subject, make sure in the first sentence you say between X date and X date, the imagined community of Vermonters grew more or stayed the same, grew more divided, grew more united, started out divided, got united, became divided again, whatever you want to argue. But just be clear at the beginning in your introduction. And number 2, I need you to have citations in the text. I want to reward you for the reading that you did, and so use the textbook and use articles that I put in the folder, the articles folder, and also, you know, use obviously class notes. You don't need to cite class notes, but I need to have citations, parenthetical citations in the text, footnotes, endnotes. All I need is the author's name or the name of the source and the page number. I need the page number so I can retrace your steps. I just want to reward you for the work you've done, the reading you've done. I don't want a bibliography, and I don't want a works cited page with no citations. Okay? Okay, great. I think that's about that. So this is Unit 5, and Unit 5 is divided into 3 sections. And the first, it begins with a little bit of the introduction, actually, of my book project. And I'm working on this book, and I want to integrate it into the course. partially for my own purposes. If I'm too busy to actually be writing, then I want to keep the project warm, but also because this is where my understanding of Vermont history is at right now. It's an interesting story, and obviously, you know, the way I taught the course 5 years ago is different from now, and 5 years before that was different from what it was 5 years ago. Courses evolved, and that's a healthy thing. So it leads up to 1890, which is the end of this week. And this week, well, it starts out by introducing you to Alonzo Valentine, who was very downhill, and this Tift family in Dorset, who was very uphill, and sort of the worlds they occupied. And their story will culminate in 1890 with this program the state government had to recruit Swedes. And they brought about 55 Swedes to Vermont and dumped them down, and then everyone agreed it was stupid, and everyone agreed to forget about it and not talk about it ever again. And that is the era from the Civil War to 1890 that is named the Gilded Age. And so this week is on the Gilded Age. And in the Gilded Age, Vermont revolved around this polarity. And this is how historians understand Vermont in the Gilded Age. It was a story of either Vermont was in decline or it was stable. And of course, downhillers are the ones who thought it was in decline, because the small towns were losing population, and there's also a widespread belief among downhillers that the quality of the people who stayed behind in small towns was going down, that they were becoming, you know, degenerate people. Meanwhile, the population of the big towns got bigger. This a lot has to do with the effect of the railroads, which tended to make a lot of jobs in small towns superfluous, particularly craftsmen. And the children of downhillers are like, I'm out of here. There's nothing for me in the small town. And so the small towns became ever more homogeneous uphill, and the big towns became ever more downhill. And the two sides went their own sort of separate ways. And downhillers thought of small towns as being in decline, but uphillers thought that their towns were perfectly stable. They were fine. I mean, there's day-to-day problems, but for the most part, they had interdependence and, you know, community and a slow pace of life. And it wasn't the people who stayed behind that were the losers, as downhillers often thought. The people who were able to make a go of staying behind were the winners. And there's some irony to this, because when the Gilded Age ends, in the 1890s, rises the most important industry in determining the future of Vermont's evolution, which is summer tourism. And it got huge. By 1900, it is the second biggest industry in the state. And summer tourism will change uphill and downhill dramatically. But in the Gilded Age, it's like in the Gilded Age, you understand uphill and downhill, and in some ways it's like now, but it's like a blurry lens on a camera, and summer tourism starts to bring it into focus. In the Gilded Age, uphillers are what you imagine uphillers to be. They're traditional, they're small town, they're provincial, they're parochial, and downhillers are cosmopolitan and into science and into progress and into development. And that makes sense. And then summer tourism is going to complicate it a great deal at the end of this week. So this unit is divided into 3 sections. The first one is on just trying to establish different kinds of people in the Gilded Age. And so I have the comparison between the world of G.G. Benedict and the world of Gramp Abbott. G.G. Benedict was a guy whose dad was a UVM professor who got rich running telegraph lines in Vermont. G.G., when he graduated from UVM, his dad bought him the Burlington Free Press, which he then was the owner and publisher of. At Gettysburg, he won the Congressional Medal of Honor. And then when he got back to Vermont, he joined every club imaginable. He was the head of the Vermont State Agricultural College, even though he didn't know how to farm. He was on the board of railroads and Vermont National Life Insurance. He was in the state senate. He belonged to the Algonquin Club, history clubs. You can imagine the whole thing. And he represents that one world of Burlington. And then on the other hand, you have Abbott, and you can see the world that he occupied. And they have 2 different skill sets, 2 different sets of what constitutes education. There's a lot of things, obviously, that Benedict could do that Abbott knew nothing about. He lived in Chelsea and never left Chelsea. But there are a lot of things that Abbott could do. Make maple syrup and fish and make stone walls and make baskets, things that Benedict had no idea how to do. And the weird thing is that it's people like Benedict that were the members of things like the Vermont Dairymen's Association, a private agency that wanted to pursue more scientific progressive farming. And everything collides in Gramp Abbott's world to not pursue scientific, efficient farming that would come at the expense of communal solidarity. So they occupy these two different worlds, and you can explore that. They're sort of models for how you understand that. The second section is on UVM and the Great Agricultural College question, which was the big political football of the era. After the Civil War, the Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act established agricultural colleges around the country. And in most states, all states in New England, they established new colleges in rural places. Amherst in Massachusetts, Storrs in Connecticut, etc. But the state leaders figured that Vermont was so small that they should just attach the agricultural college to UVM. And that made uphillers mad in the first place, and then UVM's administration just stole the money, is really what they did, and there was no agricultural college to speak of. And so it was in this regard, politically, that there was this enormous amount of social conflict. And I talk about this guy, Zuar Jameson, who was from Irisburg, who was a mid-hiller and walked the line between uphill and downhill. At least he tried to. And he was a member of this thing, the Vermont Agricultural, the Board of Agriculture. The Board of Agriculture was a state agency that also wanted to improve farming for people. And Jameson was kind of a progressive farmer, even though he grew up uphill. But he understood uphillers as well. And he noticed that uphillers had no interest in the Board of Agriculture's activities. So when most people had lost interest in the board, it was basically him. He went around the state and asked people what their big issue was, and the uphillers told him, get that damn agricultural college out of Burlington, put it in Randolph or somewhere in the center of the state. And so he then had to write a report about whether they should divide the agricultural college from UVM, and he was really torn about it because where's the compromise? It's either in Burlington or it's not in Burlington. And he finally came out in favor of separating the college from UVM, the Ag College, and so he got fired from the board, and then he was elected to the state legislature where he became the head of the Agriculture Committee, and he went to war with UVM, and everyone was mad at everyone else. And that's kind of what it's like. But I don't know, I mean, when uphillers and downhillers are in conflict, is that when you make the greatest progress towards reconciling freedom and unity? And so this is where you're at by the mid-1870s, and it's at that point that a guy named Highland Hall, the third section of this unit, began to really make the biggest movement towards erecting the Bennington Battle Monument. Highland Hall was a lawyer. He'd grown up uphill in Bennington in the 1790s. He knew Green Mountain Boys. And he did become a lawyer and moved downhill, but he understood uphillers, and he loved history, and he was very impressed by the